Officer Ethan Caldwell thought it was just a routine stop. Until he pulled out his gun. And pulled the trigger. In an instant, his entire career collapsed. Lights flashed in the rearview mirror. No surprise there. Regina Owens sighed, exhaustion clinging to her every breath. Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, an unconscious response to the rising tension. She eased her black Audi Q7 to the curb, the red and blue lights reflecting off the glossy paint. The houses lining the quiet street in Brentwood, Tennessee stood tall and pristine, their manicured lawns bathed in the early evening light. It was a beautiful sight, but she knew it wasn't for her. She had lived here for more than a decade with her husband, Samuel Owens, the director of the FBI. But no matter how many years had passed, she knew all too well the scrutiny. A black woman, alone in a luxury car, driving through this neighborhood? Suspicion was inevitable. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The cops hadn't even gotten out of the car yet. But she could already sense what was coming. Taking a deep breath, Regina reached for her phone and pressed the record button, placing it on the passenger seat. Not that she expected this to go viral. She just knew better than to rely on anyone else's account. The patrol car door opened. Officer Ethan Caldwell stepped out, his every movement exuding the arrogance of someone accustomed to unchecked power. He was tall, in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, his features rigid as if a smile never reached his lips. His uniform was neat, his badge polished, but what caught Regina's attention most was his hand, hovering near the holster, an unspoken warning. She exhaled through her nose. There it was. Caldwell stopped right by the window, far enough away that she had to crane her neck to see him clearly. "License and registration," he said flatly, emotionless. Regina kept her hands on the wheel. "Mind telling me why I was pulled over?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You failed to signal at your last turn." Regina blinked. She had driven this route thousands of times. Each time with equal care. Her chest tightened. The lump in her throat was familiar. She had heard this story before. Seen faces like hers in haunting videos. But this time, she wasn't just a spectator. She was the protagonist. Regina took a deep breath. She knew, she had signaled. The moment she nodded slowly, it was more than a gesture, it was an acknowledgement. Not to Caldwell, but to herself. "Okay," she said, her voice calm but a little heavy. "My license and registration are in my wallet. I'll reach for them now." Caldwell didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her as if he were considering something. His gaze traveled from her face, down to her tailored jacket, to the delicate gold bracelet that glittered on her wrist. Her nails were neatly manicured, a testament to her attention to detail. A small smile played on his lips. "Go ahead, but slow down." Regina forced herself to stay calm. She knew this game, had played it before. But this time, something was different. There was a nervousness beneath her confident facade, as if she were treading on more dangerous territory than she had imagined. She moved carefully, neither fast nor slow, to retrieve the papers. As she handed them to Caldwell, she looked him straight in the eye, trying to figure out what was going on in his mind. But instead of checking right away, he just stood there, continuing to watch her as if waiting for something. Regina let the silence drag on, but it only made her feel more nervous. Finally, Caldwell glanced at her license. For a fleeting moment, his expression changed, but then quickly returned to its calm. "You live around here?" His tone was casual, as if they were just chatting idly at a grocery store. Regina clenched her jaw. "About 2 miles down the road." Caldwell smacked his lips, scanning the address again. "Really?" he said slowly. "What brings you here?" Regina smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do I need a reason to drive in my neighborhood?" Caldwell's gaze returned to her, the smile on his lips fading. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Regina didn't look at him as she replied. You're not. Her words felt like a slap in the air between them. Caldwell's shoulders stiffened, his fingers twitching near his gun holster. The atmosphere in the car changed instantly, from a power-charged exchange to something more dangerous. A tense silence filled the air, as if they were both considering their next move. Caldwell's voice dropped, carrying an unspoken warning. I'd be careful with that attitude if I were you. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Regina tilted her head, her heart pounding but her expression remaining unbelievably calm. How exactly am I making this harder? Caldwell didn't answer right away. But the look in his eyes, that look said it all. Caldwell stared at her, his gaze as cold as the water at night. The moment stretched too long, as tense as a string about to snap. Then, with a snort, he turned, striding slowly toward his cruiser. Her license was still in his hand, an unspoken provocation. Regina took a deep breath, her hands pressing into the leather steering wheel, feeling the friction to steady her. She had met men like this before. They liked to control, to make others feel small in their shadow. But today, she was not small. Not to him. Not again. She glanced at the recording phone, the small light from the screen reflecting in her eyes. Instinct told her she would need this recording. Not now, but soon. But Caldwell wasn't leaving yet. Ethan Caldwell sat in the patrol car, his gaze heavy as he looked down at the license plate in his hand. Regina Owens. The name was unfamiliar, but the address on it made him pause. A feeling of unease crept up on him, as if some puzzle piece was out of place. He glanced into the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes locked on the black Audi still parked under the yellow streetlights. She didn't seem worried, and that bothered him. People who got pulled over, especially women, were often confused. They fumbled, hurriedly complied, eager to avoid trouble. But not her. She just sat there, calm, in control. As if she wasn't afraid of him. A dull ache spread in Ethan's chest. He wasn't a bad cop. 20 years on the job, he'd done everything by the book, the way it was supposed to be done. He had a reputation for being stern, quiet, unforgiving of explanations, and certainly not for anyone who thought they could outsmart him. But she pushed back, just enough to be defiant. The faint smirk in her voice, the way she didn't rush to explain, the way her eyes locked on him without reservation. Like she knew something he didn't. Ethan's fingers tapped the dashboard. A woman like that, in a car like that, on a night like this. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was just instinct. But Ethan had learned one thing in all his years in the business. His instincts were never wrong. Ethan stared at the computer screen mounted on his dashboard, his fingers quickly typing her name, Regina Owens. Married. No criminal record. Nothing that gave him a good reason to continue. But something in his gut told him he needed to dig deeper. The feeling crept into his mind, like a cold wind down his spine. His radio crackled. Status check, Unit 22. Ethan picked up. Routine stop. No backup. There was a pause before the dispatcher answered. Copy, Unit 22. Ethan put the receiver down, his gaze fixed on the screen again. Nothing suspicious. No reason to continue. And yet he wanted to. Because there was something about her that was so calm. So sure of herself. People don't do this when they're pulled over by the police. They're usually tense, flustered, or nervous. That's what makes them harmless. He glanced out, toward the Audi. She was still, her silhouette suspiciously relaxed. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, no hint of uncertainty. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't let her leave feeling like she'd won. Before he knew it, the decision was made. He tucked her license and registration under his arm and pushed the car door open. His shoes hit the pavement with a decisive thud. His steps were slower this time, more cautious, heavier with the thought lingering in his head. He stopped by her window. Regina turned her head, her eyes still unreadable. "Is everything okay, officer?" Her voice was calm, unwavering. Ethan watched her silently for a moment, then leaned down, resting his hand on the car door frame. "Do you have somewhere to go?" His voice was low and slow, carrying something heavier than the words he'd just spoken. Regina blinked. "Once. Home." Ethan let out a long breath, letting the silence stretch between them. Then he did something he knew would unsettle her. He let out a small, amused laugh. "You're not like the people who live in this neighborhood." He watched her, waiting for a reaction. And then, he saw it, a subtle shift in her eyes. Something flashed behind that look. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper. A secret. Regina inhaled through her nose. Exhaled slowly through her mouth. Nothing scary. The air was colder, but not enough to make her shiver. "And you don't look like a cop who follows procedure." Her voice was even, but heavy. The smile on Ethan's face was fleeting for a second. But he quickly hid it. His fingers tapped the roof of her car, an unconscious rhythm of someone used to being in control. He felt the weight of the holster on his hip. The badge on his chest was a reminder of his power. Years of unchallenged. But tonight, perhaps, would be different. Regina was steady. She sensed the change in the air. Ethan Caldwell was testing her, pushing her limits to see how she would react. This was no longer a simple traffic violation. She had met his kind. Officers saw badges as weapons. Not to enforce the law, but to enforce obedience. The kind of people who needed to remind the world that they were in charge. Especially people like her. But Regina was not afraid. She took a breath, deeper. Her gaze locked on his. Unyielding. "If you have my information," she said, her tone steady, "may I go now?" Caldwell tilted his head, amusement flashing in his eyes. "What's the rush?" Regina didn't blink. "I have nothing more to say. Either write me a ticket, or let me go." For a second, he was silent. Just stood there, watching her. Considerant. Then, without warning, he reached for the doorknob. She locked it. Just before his fingers touched it. Her body didn't tremble, but her heart pounded. Caldwell paused, his expression hard. "Get out of the car." His voice lost its false condescension. Regina looked him straight in the eye. "On what grounds?" He moved his hand to his side. But Regina didn't back away. Not at all. Regina knew where this was going. Knew that if she jerked the wrong way, even the slightest movement, Caldwell would declare her resisting. That she was being difficult. That she was a threat. But she also knew something else. He didn't know who she was. Regina took a deep breath, steadying it, then rolled her shoulders back, relaxing her body while her mind tensed. She had given him every opportunity to de-escalate. But he didn't take that path. She slowly reached for her phone, not taking her eyes off Caldwell. His eyes flickered, assessing her every little movement. "I'm recording," Regina said, her voice steady, unwavering. Caldwell let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, you think that scares me?" He leaned forward a little, a small but calculated move. "Do you know how many times I've heard that?" His fingers twitched, a little closer to his holster, enough to send a wordless warning. Regina saw it. And she knew others had seen it, too. In the nearby houses, doors opened. A man across the street, still in his work clothes, pulled out his phone. An older woman walking her dog stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth hanging open at the sight before her. If Caldwell wanted an audience, he would have one. Regina lifted the phone, turning the screen toward him. "Badge number?" she asked, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Caldwell's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked uncertain. But only for a brief moment, and then he quickly covered it up. "I told you to get out of the car." His voice was firmer than before, but there was something in his eyes that wavered. Regina didn't move. "You refuse to comply," he pressed, hoping to build pressure. She didn't flinch. "I'll step outside." She spoke slowly, clearly. "But only if you call your superiors, and tell them you just pulled over the FBI director's wife." The words dropped like a bomb. For the first time, Caldwell blinked. Hesitance crossed his face, and the hand hovering near the gun stiffened. Across the street, the man filming took a step forward, his voice low but clear. "Did she just say FBI?" Caldwell clenched his fists, his nostrils flared. He didn't back down. But he didn't dare move any further, either. Regina saw it. And so did everyone else. But this time, the doubt was there, creeping into every dark corner of her consciousness. The surrounding eyes were not just curious but skeptical, a silent question hanging in the air: was this a mistake? Or was it worse? Caldwell wasn't done yet. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell hesitated. Regina saw it. The moment stopped, the tightening of his jaw, the way his body stiffened, the slight wavering he probably didn't even notice. She had broken something. But hesitation wasn't retreat. He squared his shoulders, lowered himself. One step forward, then another. "Get out of the car now." Regina didn't move. Her phone was still recording, the screen glowing like a silent but powerful witness. She held it higher, so everyone could see it. "I asked your superiors." Her voice was calm, but firm. "Unless you have a valid reason, I have a legal right to remain in my car." The crowd grew. Neighbors were coming out of their homes, phones in hand. The tension shifted, she was no longer the suspect. He was the one being watched, judged. Ethan's pulse pounded. He was in control. He had always been in control. But now this woman, this damn woman, was making him look weak. And weakness was not something he could tolerate. His hand dropped to his holster. Regina saw it. She sensed the change before her eyes even registered it. The moment everything went from tense to real danger. A moment that could mean life or death. She'd been in high-stakes situations before. Had seen power abused. Had seen how a uniform and a gun could turn a man into a monster. But she hadn't thought tonight would be one of those moments. Hadn't thought it would escalate so quickly. But then it did. Caldwell's fingers tightened around the hilt of the gun. He pulled it from its holster, a smooth, effortless motion, like breathing. Too easy. Regina barely had time to react. A gasp rang out from the onlookers. Then a voice, sharp and terrified. "What the hell is he doing?" Another voice, a man's this time. "He just pulled out a gun." Pointed it at her. And for a moment of terrifying silence, the world stopped. All eyes were on the gun, on the man holding it, on the woman facing it. Regina swallowed. She didn't just see it. She knew it. She'd seen that look before. And this time, she wasn't sure she could escape. Regina stood in the middle of the street, no longer the peaceful place it once was. The screams, the honking of cars, and the chaotic footsteps created a symphony of fear. This city had once been her home, a place where she could walk without worry. Now, it was all just a memory. She felt a chill run down her spine as she looked into Caldwell's eyes, a dull gray of despair and anger. But Regina didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood there, back straight, eyes steady. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Her voice was firm, not a trace of a tremor. Her words cut through the night, through the tension that hung over the crowd. Caldwell didn't lower his gun. His breathing was heavy, each beat rising and falling in his chest like a cornered animal. He knew the odds were against him, but he couldn't back down. Not in front of all these people. Not with everyone watching. Then there was the sound of hurried footsteps. Another voice, sharp and authoritative. "Officer Caldwell, put down your weapon." Caldwell stiffened at the familiar voice. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see Sergeant Raymond Briggs, the superior he had once respected. But now Briggs's face was filled with rage. His eyes were looking at Caldwell not just as a subordinate but as a criminal. "Put down your damn weapon." Briggs growled, taking a step forward. The air around him froze. Caldwell's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. Regina could feel his control slipping away. He was lost everything. And everyone could see it. But the damage was done. Caldwell's fingers twitched, and his body shook in the conflict between will and reality. Behind him, Briggs had no patience to wait. "I said put down your weapons. Now." Briggs took a step forward, his voice a knife cutting into Caldwell's troubled mind. "Two choices. Obey or make things worse." Caldwell gasped. His eyes darted, searching for an escape. But all he saw were cold faces, judgmental eyes. He had no escape. Then finally, he let go. The gun dropped, not quickly, not decisively, but enough to make the crowd sigh in relief. "Hollow it," Briggs ordered, his voice hard. Caldwell hesitated. But he knew, this battle was over. Briggs took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He slid the weapon back into place, not taking his eyes off Caldwell. Regina didn't blink, her cold gaze fixed on the man across from her. She didn't need to answer Briggs' question right away, knowing the anger inside her hadn't subsided. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Briggs asked, his voice tinged with concern. Regina kept her eyes on Caldwell. "I want my license and registration back." Caldwell didn't move. Briggs stepped forward, closer, his hand on his weapon in case things got worse. "Give them the papers, now." Caldwell gritted his teeth. His hand shook as he reached into his breast pocket, pulling out the papers that should never have been kept. Without looking at anyone, he threw them onto Regina's dashboard like they were trash. Regina picked them up, no thank you, no concerned glance. Her silence was the deepest contempt. Briggs turned to her. "Do you want to file a formal complaint?" Regina exhaled slowly, trying to steady her breathing. But even as she controlled her heartbeat, she knew there was still something to say. She couldn't let him leave without understanding the consequences of her actions. Briggs frowned. "Ma'am." Regina shifted in her chair, turning all the way to Caldwell. She wanted him to see her, to see more clearly the woman he had just pointed a gun at. So that he would never forget. "My name is Regina Owens." Her voice was calm but authoritative. "My husband is Samuel Owens, Director of the FBI." The air around them suddenly became thick. Caldwell stiffened, his face paled in an instant. His lips parted but no words came out. His brain was trying to process the information he had just heard, but the results were clear. Briggs was stunned, too. His eyes darted back and forth between Regina and Caldwell, as if he were witnessing a bomb explode that no one could stop. Regina let her words sink in, letting each word sink into Caldwell's fear. Then she continued, her voice unwavering. "And you just pointed a gun at me." A ripple rose from the onlookers. They whispered, some gasped, the tension in the air turning into something heavier, more terrifying. For the first time that night, Caldwell looked sick. He understood. He knew what he had done. And he knew his career was over right there. Regina reached for her phone, pausing the recording. She had everything she needed. But Caldwell's nightmare had only just begun. His breathing became rapid, uneven. His chest rose and fell faster as the weight of the moment weighed down on him. The silence around him was more terrifying than any sound. Briggs said nothing, but his eyes held everything. He walked slowly toward Caldwell, while the rest of the street remained dead in wordless shock. "You just pointed a gun at the FBI director's wife." Caldwell swallowed, but his throat was as dry as desert sand. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his hand, though he tried to keep it steady, was shaking as he gripped his gun belt. She was uncooperative. He stammered, his voice lower, weaker, as if he didn't believe his own defense. Briggs's eyes flashed in disbelief, a cold spark cutting through the space between them. "Uncooperative," he repeated, slowly, each word small but powerful. "You turned a routine stop into a fucking incident. You pointed a gun at an innocent woman." The air seemed to freeze as his voice dropped, colder than ever. "And now, you're done." Caldwell's stomach twisted. His mouth opened, as if to say something, but no sound came out. Every excuse stuck in his throat, meaningless and helpless. Briggs didn't wait for him to collect his reasons. He turned to Regina, his voice firm, without a trace of hesitation. "Ma'am, I need to formally apologize. On behalf of this department, this should never have happened." Regina nodded, a brief gesture, but her face remained expressionless. She hadn't come here to hear an apology. She had come to see accountability. Briggs pressed the button on her radio. "I need Internal Affairs to notify me immediately. Officer Caldwell is being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." A voice came over the radio. "Copy, Sergeant." Caldwell's world collapsed in real time. His heart stopped in a moment of absolute terror. He was startled when Briggs turned to face him. "Badge and gun. Now." Caldwell's pulse pounded in his ears like a death knell. He blinked, searching for an opening, an opportunity to turn the situation around. But Briggs's gaze made it clear, there was no turning back. "Wait, me, now." Caldwell knew better than to argue. His fingers fumbled with the buckle of his holster, unbuckling his belt, drawing his weapon. A sense of wrongness filled him as he held it out, but he had no choice. His hands shook as he removed his badge, a badge he'd worn with pride for over 20 years. He placed both items in Briggs's outstretched hand. And as soon as they left his, it felt like his entire identity had been stripped away. Briggs nodded, clear and decisive. "You are relieved of duty pending investigation. Leave the scene now." Caldwell clenched his jaw, every muscle in his face strained with rage, humiliation, utter disbelief. But he knew there was no war to be won. Not here. Not now. He turned away, avoiding the eyes of the crowd. Avoiding the cameras that were still recording. Each step he took away was heavier than the last, as if his entire life were being crushed under its own weight. Regina watched him go, his steps heavy as if each step was a reminder of his humiliation. She couldn't take her eyes off the fall of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. Ethan Caldwell, who had spent his career wielding power as a weapon, was now being turned against the very system he had once manipulated. His back was stiff, his fists clenched, as if trying to hold on to some vestige of his former authority. But it was all gone. In front of an entire neighborhood, he was no longer the ruler. The crowd didn't cheer. No one celebrated. No one jeered. There was only a heavy silence, the emptiness of something that had almost happened but fortunately hadn't reached the end of the tragedy. Briggs turned to Regina, his eyes expectant. "Do you want to press charges?" Regina took a deep breath. The old version of her might have said no, might have chosen to move on quietly, avoiding unnecessary conflict. But that version no longer exists. She thinks of the women who never had a chance to speak. The ones who were forgotten in the flashbulbs. The ones who never got to come home. She lifts her head, her voice steady. "I want him to be held accountable." Briggs nods. We'll take it from here. The crowd disperses, but this moment isn't forgotten. It will echo far beyond this street. When Regina gets home, her phone buzzes incessantly. Texts from friends, colleagues, and journalists clamoring for the story. And then, finally, a text from Samuel. She answers, listening to his voice on the phone. Calm, controlled, but still concerned. Are you okay? She sighs, letting the emotion pass. I'm fine. There's a long pause, then Samuel asks, his voice colder. What's his name? Regina closed her eyes, knowing what was coming. It's been taken care of. Samuel didn't answer right away. She knew he was making his own call. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell was national news. His name was in every headline. His actions were dissected in every newscast. Footage of the moment he pulled out a gun and shot an unarmed woman, the wife of the FBI director, was all over the media. But this time, Regina wasn't just the victim in the story. She was a reminder. That power doesn't make you invulnerable. That accountability comes, sooner or later. That no matter who you are, no matter what your badge is, what your title is, or how many years you've served, there are lines that no one is allowed to cross. Regina sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the weight of the long day finally sink in. She was home. But so many others weren't. She looked at her phone, saw the messages of support, the public outrage calling for justice. And for the first time that night, she let herself breathe. Because this time, the right person won.